Welcome to the first Wellbeing Culture Forum of 2021. My name is Mikolaj Sekutowicz. I'm the curator and CEO of Therme Art. Today, in April 2021, people are still living in more or less strict quarantine in many parts of the world. Cultural live gatherings are rare, and the collective experiences we share mostly through these video filters. I would like to claim that this situation is just highlighting a general tendency in Western modern culture. Our science, our medicine, our coexistence with animals and plants, our design and architecture are dominated through techniques and structures of distance and isolation. Especially in our relationship with nature, the acute problem of this alienation from our environment becomes clear. If we do not see ourselves as a part of nature, but continue to develop our cities and technologies as a counterpart, displace trees, plants, animals from our living space, we will soon lack the air we need to breathe. The great biologist Lynn Margulis has proven that the main factor in evolution is not competition, but symbiosis. Culturally, however, we still seem programmed to compete. In order to be able to develop symbiotic forms of life, we must first readjust our cultural behavior and our consciousness to the natural environment. In essence, the question of today's necessary understanding and reconnecting with the processes of nature is a cultural problem that needs to be addressed from a very practical perspective. Developing and trying concrete cultural experiences not only within a theoretical space, but through a multisensory environment as a play and ongoing experimentation. In the field of experiential art, which has seen revolutionary development in recent years, we can identify a new canvas for the production of reality bearing an enormous potential of an overall cultural reorientation and its transformational power. Having gathered artists and curators of Reconnection today, this discussion will explore how art can curate these paths, helping us to navigate this crisis and to use these moments to explore new ways of relating to our world. We just came back from Miami, where Superblue, the new venture dedicated to bring new forms of art and public engagement together, previewed its first center, with us, Therme Art, a strategic investor. Among others, world premiered at Superblue in Miami is the installation Forest of Us by Es Devlin, one of our panelists today. Her multimedia, large-scale performative environments offer profound experiences of active immersion. She develops these spheres not only for an art audience, but also much more broadly for audiences of pop concerts or sport events. In an age of separated echo chambers, she creates collective resonance connecting diverse communities. Resonance is also the theme of the London Design Biennale this June, where Es is artistic director. Tino Sehgal creates connections through more minimal means. His material is the body and the mind of the participants in his works. Building a time-based space of curated cohabitation with his audience, he incorporates abstract discourses in concrete actions and ties them back to the physicality, guiding into an intense experience of the now. The artworks of Torkwase, Dyson are redefining our relationship to urban space and its power infrastructures from a perspective of history, economy, physics, and materiality. In doing so, she questions which narratives of injustice and violence bind us to these environments and reimagine alternative paths of connections. Today's moderator, Hans Ulrich Obrist, is a pioneer in building bridges between art and the issues of society. How can we produce reality is a question that constantly resonates in his curatorial framework. Wherever he appears, he acts as an agent for the networking of artists, social activities, urban space, and the natural environment. And with this, I open the virtual stage, Hans Ulrich, and give you the word.
Thank you very much, Mikolaj, and it's wonderful that today, for the first time in 21, we can continue our ongoing conversations, our ongoing collaborations, because it's more than conversations, it's conversations which hopefully produce reality, which produce not only art and architecture and projects for the environment and society, but also, as we discussed actually in our very first panel we did together, maybe also cities for the future. I wanted to quote here actually Alexis Pauling-Gams from the extraordinary book Dab, which is basically an homage to Sylvia Winter, or maybe it's actually not so much an homage to Sylvia Winter, but it is about thinking with Sylvia Winter. Sylvia Winter is someone who is studying the multiple histories of knowledge, and Alexis Pauling-Gams says that we have the opportunity now as a species fully in touch with each other, and that's of course referring to technology, to the way we are connected. So we have the opportunity basically as a species fully in touch with each other to unlearn and relearn our own patterns of thinking and storytelling in a way that allows us to be actually in communion with our environment, as opposed to a dominating colonialist separation from the environment. And I think today's speakers have in common actually to work on such communions, on such also gatherings. And I thought it would be great to maybe begin with Es, because as you have just opened actually the project with Superblue in Miami, Forest of Us, it actually takes as its starting point the symmetries between the structure within us that allow us to breathe and the structures around us that make breathing possible. So it is a piece about the bronchial trees that exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide, and it has to do a lot with some previous projects actually on which we collaborated, like your Do It project, which has to do with the trees, but it has also to do with the design biennial Forest of Change, which Mikolaj mentioned, where you will plant a forest of 400 trees, actually, where the Biennale in that sense will produce reality. Can you tell us a little bit about how you create with these installations, with your instruction piece, with your biennial, actually with these three different projects, a communion with our environment as opposed to this separation?
It's interesting because during the sort of depth of the lockdown, as you remember, we were all talking to each other on this new Zoom at the time, which felt new to us then and doesn't feel so new to us now. And I was reflecting on Shakespeare, that so much of the period when Shakespeare was writing, the theatres were closed due to plague. And he actually spent quite a lot of time near where my studio is, because his friend, the actor Edward Alleyne, had bought a house down in what was then the country in southeast London, because central London felt too dangerous of a place to be. And he spent a lot of time making small miniatures of the sonnets. And one of them had this phrase, "Those bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang." And this phrase, I didn't actually even know anything about the timing of the writing of that piece, and that it was during a plague year until I researched it. But the phrase kept coming to my mind. And my equivalent, I guess, of that miniature was the Do It project that you invited many of us to take part in. And it came at such a crucial time for us, I think, when we weren't able perhaps to practice using our normal means and materials and scale and interaction and human interaction specifically. So the Do It involved an invitation, a recipe for anyone to take a photograph of a tree, to take an X-ray of the bronchial trees that everyone carries within them, and to observe the symmetrical geometries and equations and mathematics at work in the bifurcating structures of both of these systems, and to understand that the reason things bifurcate is to maximize their exposure. And of course, it's something we know, but it helps us to look at the visual symmetry. And the work in Miami was conceived as a three-dimensional, walkable maze version of that, so that perhaps by the end of having walked through these geometries and having walked through a film that helps to contextualize for an audience and set up the terms of engagement and helps them to understand a way to read the ensuing environment, that perhaps emerging from that, this visual souvenir, almost like as sticky as an advert. The opening of the work in Miami behaves something like an advert. It's 2.5 minutes long. It manipulates, I guess, emotion in the spirit of an advert for a car, but it's not an advert for a car. It's an invitation to observe the symmetry between your lungs and some trees. But it aims to work on you with that kind of simple terms of engagement that an advert does. It tries to hijack that mechanic. And I guess the forest in Somerset House comes from a slightly different imperative, more that Jonathan Ricci, when he showed me around Somerset House, said you're not allowed to put trees here. And quite recently, Mikolaj had been showing me his plans to reforest the Strand. So I thought, well, if I'm not allowed to put trees here, then certainly the first thing that we should do is plant a forest here if we can, and see if we could gain insistence from the public that the trees might perhaps stay. So that's really where that imperative came from. But it all started with the Do It, of course, Hans Ulrich. The Do It was where it began.
Thank you. As actually, Mikolaj, you've seen the work, you've seen the piece, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's very seldom that you see it in contemporary art, actually. That something is working on all these different senses that you're not used to use them during the perception of art. You're used to, to be manipulated by advertisement into buying, for example, a car, but not into having like a philosophical thought. And this is, I think, something where Es is using all the different possibilities of the medium. Really, like not only three-dimensional, but I would say even four-dimensional.
And that, of course, brings us right away to Torkwase. Torkwase, we have had numerous interviews and conversations and worked together on Back to Earth for the Serpentine. You work in multiple forms, and actually told me in a conversation once that you describe your own practice as a painter whose compositions address the continuity of movement, of climate change, of infrastructure and architecture. And of course, these subjects in relationship to each other produce abstractions in your work that explore the history and future of Black spatial liberation strategies and environmental racism. I wanted to ask you the same question I asked Es also, to maybe react to that quote of Alexis Pauling-Gams in relation to Sylvia Winter about this opportunity of us as a species fully in touch with each other to unlearn and relearn our own patterns of thinking and storytelling in a way that allows us to be actually in communion with our environment, as opposed to a dominating colonialist separation from the environment, because it seems deeply related to your work with art, but also with architecture.
Yes, I want to say I'm very interested in Pauline's work, Alexis's work. She's a dear friend of mine, and her work and a lot of thinking that's happening with Sylvia Winter in particular is to really understand how constructions of knowing the human has existed. And I think the really what we all sort of gain from Winter's work is this idea of we have to unlearn not only habits, we have to unlearn disciplines. And as we deconstruct and unlearn these disciplines, new scaffoldings have to be built. And those scaffoldings, intellectual, theoretical, quotidian, phenomenological, have to be built in a way that people can, in my mind, in a way that people can sustain improvisation, right? So that there's a condition in this undisciplining and unlearning and decolonizing and unwhitening and unerasing all of these histories of being in relationship with ecosystems that are, you know, like you put very clearly, that are in relationship to our bodies as an ecosystem, right? So there's this kind of duality and discursive happening at the same time. And I want to hold on to the idea of a duality and hold on to the idea of discursive Because when we are looking and thinking about each other one-to-one, there's one person, there's a second person. And then those people can create a discursive that involves all kinds of histories of making and inventing and cleaning water and making food and making architectures that have to do with sort of hyper-local environments, and also have to do with histories of rituals that really solidify being. And this idea of nature, nurture, advancement is completely off course, because of the violence of modernistic conditions. So I think both Pauline and both Winters are trying to get at that, unlearning disciplines and unlearning how we even identify sentient beings on the planet. So yeah, my work is very much about that kind of perspective in relationship to the built environment, in relationship to transatlantic slave trade more specifically, and in relationship to what it means to defy, work through chattel slavery, work through kinds of emancipations, and work through sort of false ideas of reconstruction, right? So, as we move through houses and architectures, we also move through trees and lands and mountains and waters, right? So, and I'm very interested, as you know, Hans, specifically right now, in ideas of like, how do you mine seabeds, right? How do you mine seabeds, particularly in geographies that have to do with the Middle Passage? So our bodies, our minds, our conditions, our senses are still in this seabed, right? And as our platelets shift, and as we think about the planet, most of fauna is under the water. Most of, how we know mountains and lava is underwater. So, the work is trying to figure that out. So the abstraction and the projects are just these tools to try to help me talk to you the way I speak to you. Do you know what I mean? So they have limitations and they're not solutions, but they are tools to help me see clearly in the world and have conversations and make kin. And that's the ecosystem I think that, I'm sort of hunkering down into. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. And can you give us a few examples? Because you're working on so many projects right now, both in the art world and in the architecture world. It would be great to hear maybe about one or two examples of how this is realized in your practice right now.
Well, I just finished a project entitled Bird and Lava, and it's at the WEX at the moment, and it consists of questions around modularity, questions around nomadicity, questions around surface and throughways. So the idea was to sort of create a kind of architecture, sculptural space that could be moved around, where there's a surface from materials like graphite, materials like wood, materials like glass, that they create these throughways. And when the body moves slightly from right to left, there's an opacity, right? So all of those things combined, for me, help me think about how these issues of environment are compounded, right? They're not just intersectional, but the way in which they happen over time and over distance creates this real condition of density and compoundedness. So what does it mean to test that through movement over time in cities, and then create pieces and fragments from that, breaking that compoundedness apart, but then taking those pieces that you've broken, those fragments that you've broken, and then putting them back together, right? In an object that is meant to be transcendental. It's meant to take you in your mind, through your mind, outside of your mind, and think about the body in relationship to the universe and all of its measurable and unmeasurable things. So the WEX was a matter of thinking through what these quotidian architecture modular conditions could do as they moved around in the space, and from these fragments create something phenomenological. So I'm thinking through, these kinds of things right now as a, way to sustain them. How do we make these technologies so that these sustainable infrastructures and the sustainable way of moving aren't a luxury? How do we think about scale in environmental technologies? That's not a luxury. So these things around scale and modularity, and I'll say in relationship to modernism and its condition of repetition or production, how do we undiscipline that to think about production in relationship to microclimates, right? And in relationship to global movement. So that's what the WEX project is trying to grapple with, and create a space for me to collaborate with different materials and different material engineers, and how that may work with sound and space. So that's just one project that's sort of in my body, working it through right now. So that's like really right what's happening right now.
In the extreme present. Thank you so much, Torkwase, and thank you so much, Es. And actually, before we discuss maybe more general questions, I wanted to ask Tino the same question. Again, the quote from Alexis Pauline Gams, basically talking about, in an interview, about the book Dab, which is not so much a genealogy to Sylvia Winter. It's not so much about influence, but it's about thinking with Sylvia Winter, which I think is so interesting. And Sylvia Winter is someone who is studying the multiple histories of knowledge. I'm going to read the quote again. We have the opportunity now as a species fully in touch with each other to unlearn and relearn our own patterns of thinking and storytelling in a way that allows us to be actually in communion with our environment, as opposed to a dominating colonialist separation from the environment. And Tino, this relates not only to your art practice, to the constructed situation, to actually live encounters between visitors and actually those who are enacting the work, which is something, of course, which is so relevant now when we think again how post-COVID, we will come together. But it's also something which plays a role in your curatorial work, thinking, for example, about the Down to Earth exhibition, which you've done with a whole group of co-curators actually in Berlin at the Gropiusbau. Could we have your reaction to the quote?
Yeah, I mean, you know me well enough to know that I basically agree. What's interesting to me in that quote is the word unlearning and patterns, and what is the actual, let's say, concrete, habitual training we need to do to actually concretely unlearn stuff, because it's easily said, but it's very difficult to do. And I want to maybe start shortly by reacting to what Mikolaj said about the term experiential art, because I sympathize with that term just as a, person, but I do think, it's worth mentioning that it's somewhat tautological, like looking at a painting in a modern art gallery, Torkwase was talking about the virus of modernity and, or modernization. Not quite sure what you said, Torkwase, but like something in that vein. Like if we look at a painting in a gallery, that's also an experience, The question is not experience yes or no, but the experience is the question is what kind of experience, and that relates to something else that Mikolaj said at the beginning, is like multisensory, and so to get a little bit more concrete, I think, if we think about modernity and what it does as this like mode of separation, of separating between like human beings and the environment, which is a difficult term, and separating between like me, the perceiver, and the world, which I cannot have any connection to, like Kant puts it. If we're trying to understand that, we have to also look at like which senses, and then let's say in a kind of regime, like in a kind of sensory regime, were highlighted, and that is the eyes. Right? So, and if we think, what are the eyes? The eyes are, so we're an eye culture, modernity is an eye culture, and the eyes are a sense of distance, I think that's my first kind of main quality that I would attribute to it. Like they look the furthest into the distance, but they also can be in contact with a lot of distance, So for me, what's interesting is to also ask, like what is our role as, let's say, people in the creative field, in the production of culture? What is our role? I think first of all, is also to ask what is our own implication into this regime, you know, and that's why I think it's very important to kind of think and create environments. In that sense, like I prefer the word immersion, which is also not the most popular word, you know, but I was defended it, you know, I did another show a few years ago at Gropiusbau around immersion, because immersion, when you think of immersion, you're not thinking of the visual right away. You're thinking of all your senses being immersed, and you're not thinking of a subject-object antagonism. You're thinking of a being together. A communion is a word that was also mentioned earlier. And I think our task can be to kind of help ourselves and others practice, because we're all I beings. We're all grown up in this time. And then now we have the screen as the Über-I, the Über-eyesight medium, you know, and we can all help each other to kind of train other senses and to provide opportunities to be in contact with other senses, you know, and to create maybe a less hierarchical relation between the senses. I'm not against the eyes. I like the eyes, but it's something which needs to be, which has kind of gone out of balance. And that's a disbalance we now find in the planet, and I don't think this is a coincidence.
It's interesting, Tino, that you mentioned the word immersion and immersed, and that you're instinctively drawn to it. And while you were talking, I was just looking up the etymology of it, because I was not aware, and I just wanted to see where it comes from. And it does come from the same root as to merge, mergere, to plunge, to dip, to be absorbed. And I think that's something that speaks to all of us, I imagine, that sense of merge, of edges and boundaries.
And it also relates to what Mikolaj said at the beginning about, which I haven't heard you say, Mikolaj, the symbiosis rather than competition. I mean, competition is also an element, can be a fun element, but again, it needs to be put into checks and balances. And I found really interesting, and makes me think of what you just said as, you know, like merging, symbiosis, you know, there's something there, like cooperating, but also being together, because symbiosis is more than cooperating, it's being together, no?
Thank you so much. This is great. And actually, I was wondering, because Tino, you talk about, you know, sympathize with experiential art. You talked about immersion as answer. I wanted to have Torkwase's reaction maybe to these two notions, to experiential art and to notions of immersion.
Before I respond to that, I want to go back to this idea of distance. And I mean, for the past maybe 2 years, I've been making projects around the idea of distance. And I think that when I set up conditions or thoughts around distance, whether it's migration, whether it's rural conditions, whether it's southwest going to the store, urban centers, this idea of distance then really dictates what immersion happens, well, what kind of immersion happens, and how different kinds of immersive experience change based on distance, based on geography. So I think it's productive to think about immersion in relationship to really deep context, right? I think, Hans, you know that I've been diving for a long time. So when you're in a space, whether it's about liquid, whether it's about a kind of condition where you're immersed in a very slow violence, in relationship to a kind of condition where you're immersed in a very fast violence, I think that all of these things really shape the way the mind, the body, you know, speaks your next word or moves to your next thought, or, you know, really dictates what kind of human you'll be and what kind of sentient being you're going to be. So immersion for me is really, it's tricky because it's so super contextual and it's so super fragile, you know, and I have to think about that in relationship to other things, in relationship to safety, in relationship to heat, in relationship to, you know, as I said, of course, distance. So that's what I'll say about immersion. I forgot what else you were asking me about, immersion and
Tino's sort of sympathy for experiential art.
But I also criticized it. That was just No, I think it's a bit of a tautology, but okay, just because you didn't quote the second part of what I said.
Yeah, I don't want to misquote you. Can you say the quote again?
I sympathize with it as a human being. I said, I find it sympathetic, experiential art, but it's not really a term which really holds its ground, because everything is an experience. Sitting in front of a painting, a modernist painting in a modern art gallery is also an experience. It's just a different kind of experience. It's also a question what kind of experience, which senses are addressed. That was my point. Sorry.
Oh, no, I understand what you're saying. Well, I'm interested in experiences that really reveal capabilities, right? So how do people set up these ecosystems of experiences that really give the viewers feel a condition of capability, right? So that experience isn't a dogmatic or didactic experience all the time, that the experience can pull out or allow for or create a condition, where capabilities are just pointed to, and, the idea of that really excites me in my own practice and looking at moments or artworks or I say experiences that pull up memory in a way that I forget a technique or a skill that I learned, say, when I was 2, or something that I remember someone doing when I was 18. Like I remember Johnny Lee Gilbert, painting out of, I was at Tougaloo College in Tougaloo, Mississippi. We were making paintings out of National Geographic magazines, right? But I remember her technique in collage from thinking about National Geographic in the way in which we thought about landscape painting, right? So how can work now that asks me to experience it over time really offer a condition where I feel my own capabilities anew?
I mean, there's an aspect to it, I think that Tino was raising with the distance of the sight sense, and also that you're raising, that's very much to do with the emotional experience, because we are very much often reduced to the intellectual experience that somehow is connected with the sight sense. But when we have the full body multisensorial experience, like smelling, like touching, like like feeling, this is something that goes much faster and much deeper into the subconscious, and this is something that I think we need not only to unlearn but to learn again, because I think a big topic that we're discussing right now is how can we learn to create without to destroy. And this is something that probably is about learning from nature, how to follow paths that are already existing. But to be able to follow them, you need to listen, you need to open up your senses, you need to open up your pores. And this is exactly what happens with a work like the one from Es, for example, where you are really like sucked into the complete, into an experience, in the sense of that it affects all your body, also on a subconscious emotional stage, where you can really relate to, and you can even de-traumatize in a certain way, because you can really go into a point where you can be vulnerable, but also not only, because you can be only vulnerable when you feel safe. So it has to be both. And this kind of art, I think, is now only unlocking, and I think this is also a part of the discussion that we have right now.
Distance isn't always given, like vision isn't always given, right? So when we're 100 feet below water, the question is visibility, right? Like how far in the distance can you see based on light? I mean, all of the particles, all of the things that exist in our world. So that, I just want to add that too in relationship to vision and distance and visibility. Like what are the conditions in experiential work that question that different abled bodies, different conditioned bodies in the corporal experience of different kinds of visibilities.
And I think just to come back and be a little kind of scratch at the surface of these words, I'm often thinking about the word entertain and how we use it now versus how it was originally intended to be used. Because entertain, entretien, means to hold among, and that there's a real beauty to that thought about, the way that when we gather together and we listen to a narrative or a story or a gesture, collectively we're held together, entretien. And experience comes, I think, used to mean the same thing as experiment. I think it used to mean trying and testing. And if you were an experienced person, it was because you had tried a lot or had tested a lot and had probably failed a lot as well. And I'm interested to see whether those words are now so kind of like coins that have, had their inscription so smoothed off them through passing and currency, that they're no longer useful to us, or not.
I think that question of Es was a great conclusion, I think, of part one. And I think one of the things, Mikolaj, we could maybe talk a little bit more about is this idea of the healing space, the idea of well-being, the reconnection actually with environment in relation to our practice, of course, leads us also beyond events. No, and Roman Kuchanik has written his wonderful book, How to Be a Good Ancestor, where he talks about this idea how we can actually liberate society from the short-termism, in which we are somehow caught in or imprisoned. And that, of course, has a long history because it's the French Annales school of historical writing, which gave priority to long-term thinking. I mean, Fernand Braudel famously talks about the longue durée, extended periods of time, as opposed to what François Simeon calls evental history. And of course, a lot of what, the world of art, of most of the art forms actually has been doing has, of course, to do with evental history. And I think one of the things which, if it's exhibitions, if it's biennales, if it's actually expos and so on. And I think in a way there is, and I think it's something which started pre-COVID, but COVID has actually made it much stronger, that there is a strong desire now of artists to work on more long durational projects, on work on new institutions. We need maybe new institutions, but also work on gardens. It's interesting, Precious Okoyomon, sees exhibitions as gardens and wants them to last much longer. At the same time, we have several artists over the last couple of weeks, actually, Gianfranco Baruchello, who's been doing it for many years, but more recently also Otobong Nkanga, Inka Shonibari have told me that they're starting farms, in a way, as projects. So this is not a metaphor, but in reality, farming, as a kind of another temporality. And Roman Kuchanik says that there are kind of different ways how we can liberate from this short-termism. It can be through cathedral thinking, it can go through deep time humility, through legacy mindset, through intergenerational justice, through holistic forecasting, or actually through transcendental goals. Now, another question I think which has come up a lot in relation to the lockdowns, to the COVID crisis, and the kind of thinking about what could happen post-COVID, it has a lot to do also what we discussed with the Serpentine and what we actually discussed with Mikolaj, is this idea also how then such initiatives are rooted, how such experiences, and I mean, Torkwase, Es, and Tino talked about experiences actually prompted by Mikolaj's question quite at the beginning, how such experiences are being rooted. And that made me think about my encounters with Edouard Glissant, who was in a way my mentor when I lived in Paris, and we met very, very regularly and did conferences and talks. And actually on the occasion of his 80th anniversary in a jazz club in Paris, Edouard Glissant in the crowd, basically said, the most urgent thing tonight, he said, is that you meet Mantia Diawara. And he took me and through the room, found Mantia, got us together and said, I want the two of you to work. And it was somehow one of the last times we saw Edouard. And ever since, Mantia and I worked together. So discussing the other day with Mantia, who now, works on this project actually for the Serpentine, for Back to Earth, in Senegal. He's working on a film, an environmental film, where he actually moved to Senegal to a hut, and he's working basically in this small house on a movie, and the movie will produce reality. The film will produce reality environmental reality to save this community, which basically is affected in a very direct way by climate change, extremely vulnerable to climate change. And he's working with this community on an association, and the film in that sense produces reality. So we discussed with Mantya about these questions, how such experiences are rooted. And we kind of remembered Edouard Glissant telling us that being rooted, and that can of course be rooted in a culture or in a locale, is important, but it's only important as long as it does not lead to the exclusion of other people's roots, as long as it does not lead to the hierarchization and election of some roots and cultures of others. So Glissant taught us in a way that we need to celebrate roots that expand elsewhere, roots that touch each other. They are not singular roots, they are roots that cover, they are roots that protect some other. And it seems very important right now, at a moment where we face, in many ways, quite the opposite of that. We face new nationalisms. Increasingly, the vaccine war is like one example for that, but we see these new nationalisms everywhere. And so I think, Glissant thinking in that regard is very important. So it's a kind of a bigger question to the three of you, but, the longue durée, Kajanik's point about how we can actually go make projects which are not about the short-termism, which are longer durational. That means that these projects are, of course, somehow rooted. And how can we then avoid the danger, Glissant describes? So I wanted to ask, as Torkwase and Tino to maybe answer to that.
Yeah, I would like to connect what you said a little bit also to the last comment of Es, because I think, like you said, healing, and as you were talking about, like entertainment, and I think it also relates to what Mikolaj was saying about, that the I is the sense which is connected to rationality, and so like modernity could also be seen as a regime of rationality. Now, most other cultures, not like before, let's say, our modernity, they didn't value rationality in this way, like we grew up, or at least I grew up with like the brain, the rationality being the highest kind of aspect of a human being, and I think this and that relates quite directly to a short-termism, because rationality is good for short-term thinking, for quite practical thinking, but it's a little bit like Newton's physics is good for, most of what happens on this earth, but it's not actually precise. It doesn't go a long way, And I think so. If we manage to change this regime of the senses and kind of maybe also introduce whatever other senses there might be, like we speak in about the sixth sense or something, then I think we can also free ourselves from this dominance of rationality, dominance of the I, and one has to say, like what we used to call, like, I don't dare to say it anymore, but like high art, such a awful term in a way, is something, sensual, but it's the most central thing in a very uncentral rationalistic world. It's not actually that sensual, like Mikolaj was also saying, at the beginning, like there's no touch, that you can imagine. It's rarely multisensory, like the modernist regime separates, the artistic disciplines along the senses, dance for the body, music for the ears, visual art for the eyes. And if we bring that together, then I think we come out of this regime of rationality. We also come to something more kind of long-term thinking, or long-term sensing, maybe.
I mean, the question is, there is systemic racism everywhere, but can there be systemic healing? Do we, we need basically to respond after we see that there are systemic things that are already rooted in our cultures, in our society for so many hundreds of years, that we will also not be able to, take away. They will always be there, because roots you cannot replace the past, So the question is, what is the contradiction that can be produced. And it's for sure not a short-term thinking, because everything what we are doing now, also during COVID, we see all the reaction from politics, all the reaction from society. They are all very, very short-term. The vaccine is a short-term solution. The mask is a short-term solution. We're not talking, for example, about the immune system. The immune system would be a long-term solution, you know, how to support the immune system of the population is something that would need to be much more systemic if we would want it really to be successful and us to be prepared for the next pathogen, pandemic. So to develop this kind of techniques is a question for culture, to focus on well-being, to focus on something that will long-term create safe and sound spaces for us to live in. And I think we can, understanding the critique of the systemic problems of our past, we have to develop very systemic and very long-term solutions for the future.
I've been thinking about this a lot. There's, of course, systemic racism, but I wrote the other day, there's systemic racism and there's also systemic liberation, right? So the idea that where does systemic liberation come from and where does it lie? And I want to read a couple things. So I'm going to give me just 1 second. I'm just going to break this thing down, talking about duration. Arundhati Roy wrote, I think of globalization like a light which shines brighter and brighter on a few people, and the rest are in darkness, wiped out. They simply can't be seen. Once you get used to not seeing something, then slowly it's no longer possible to see it. So let's say that that's true, right? That it's no longer possible to see the thing, the entity. But on the flip side, like the energy or the humans that you're not seeing see themselves and also see. Do you see what I'm saying? So this idea of what is not being seen and who is being erased, mind you, while the erasure is happening, why the violence is happening, why the dispossession is happening, there's always something under the belly pushing, seeing themselves, creating liberation strategies, archiving these strategies, and passing them on through the body. So I want to make that point. Systemic racism, systemic imperialism, systemic liberation, systemic improvisation. So just that for 1 second. And I want to go to Glissant to say one thing. I just want to be clear on my notes when I'm saying this. In talking about the dark, Glissant says, exile can be born even when it comes as a bolt from the blue. Okay? Now, what is Glissant? I know, Hans, you and I envy that in a way you had a chance and opportunity to become friends and close with him. But what does that mean, a bolt from the blue, from this place of exile? Again, that in my mind is how do we concentrate on the histories of systemic liberation, where we understand erasure as a violent thing and systemic thing and a global economy in all of these different environmental ways. And I want to go back to the compound metaphor. It's like, how do we understand that these things are compounded and they're at different speeds? That's Rob Dixon. Okay, so Rob Dixon argues and allows us to see that there are different paces in violence, and there are different paces in this idea of the modern, I'll say, the virus, like you mentioned, of modernism, but also the idea of the violence that comes with real dispossession of, I'll just say, good food, good communion, good love, good friendship, and good people. And how do we, dismantle societies where they, criminalize not only migration, but groups of people, right? How do you criminalize Black sociality? Well, you criminalize it, right, by inundating this idea of fast violence on the body, right? So I just want to think about the ways in which violence has been represented as this fast, harsh, instant thing on the Black body anyway, in relationship to death. And then you have the very slow violence of modernism, the slow violence of environmental racism, the slow violence of, I'll say, capital racism. So when we think about turning this big load that we have, I want us to, in my practice, I want us to think and not be afraid to, really attack these conditions, both in these individual ways, but also in the ways of the collective. So that when we move towards new cities and we think about the ways in which cities are growing and more, the populations are going to be living in cities in the next 20 and 50 years, more than they do in these rural conditions, we're going to take with us all of this bullshit that has been a part of where we are today. So how do we get into that liberation condition in a radical way? I'm trying to figure that out. I'm trying to pull that out. And I think that that's the only way to really, like I said, create infrastructures where sustained liberations can happen, where sustained improvisations can happen within these cities and within these architectures and within these agricultural landscapes. So I'm just trying to figure it out, but I know the people who aren't being seen see very well.
I think, like with practicality, with really exactly what you have said, Torkwase, that we need to create this world, we need to produce this reality, we need to give examples, and we need to try out, in the sense of experiential art as an experiment, exactly as Es said, that we need to experiment and we need to create safe spaces where we can experiment with society, but in a positive way, Maybe we don't need to point anymore so much into criticizing things, because we know what everything went wrong, and now based on this we can maybe build something new, build something that that prevents this to repeat history, to repeat itself, because sometimes nowadays I have the feeling that we live in a almost like captured in chains of the history repeating itself again and again, and we are basically reliving traumata, and we are bringing back the ghosts from the past, and we are basically reliving through these traumata again and again. And this re-traumatization now is spreading through generations that are focusing on horrors of history. And I think history, but also the history of every individual, shows that we cannot basically live in the past. We have to create a future, and we have to create it with the best intentions we have. Otherwise, where the young people will have the motivation, where they will have the energy, where they will have the the
I don't know
joy.
if I agree with that, though. I don't know if I agree with that setup. I understand what you're saying, but I don't know that I agree, because people have different ways of knowing, right? And what we assume we know about horrors, right? And what we assume we know about re-traumatization also has in it a lot of things that we don't understand how that slow violence happened. So I think, to bring in this idea of distance again, if we think about history not just as a condition of the past in relationship to time, but we think about human development in relationship to ideas of distance. We can go to cars, we can go to automobiles, we can go to walking, we can go to swimming, we can go to boating. So I think that the ways in which we understand why we need a new future in new cities have got to be simultaneously understand not just the horrors of the past, but the specters of the past, right? The hauntings of the past that are still in us, which then brings us to how do we really heal from these traumas. And some of them are going to repeat themselves, and then some of them won't repeat themselves. So that, again, that simultaneity has to happen. And I would say that as we build culture, everyone doesn't know everything at the same pace in terms of how we got here environmentally.
I'm really interested, Torkwase, I wrote down so much what you just said, just some of these phrases about sustained improvisation, systemic liberation. This is, such useful tools and phrases for us to work with. And I think something that you talked about, pace and scale of time, reminds me of the Stefano Mancuso and also Richard Powers in the Overstory, about the scale at which we see and the scale at which we don't see in terms of time specifically. That if only, you know, the moment when Edward Pfeffer invented the time-lapse photography of flowers growing, roots growing, then suddenly we were able to perceive plants as living beings, because guess what? We saw them at our own recognizable pace, scale. The scale at which we, with our particular pair of eyes, can see movement is only when we see the plant sped up. Or in terms of, you know, when we see aerial photographs of how rivers have meandered and twisted, we only recognize them as, you know, moving beings when they are sped up to align with the specific scale at which we are able to perceive growth and to perceive movement. And this concept that you outline of slow and fast violence is really fascinating to me, and I think essential for us to really use that lens and to recognize how much we don't perceive because we're not looking at the right scale.
Yeah, and I want to say, Mikolaj, you also provided me the platform to think about these histories, these presents, and these futures. So I think I only disagree with you in the way you set up what you just said, but I think we understand the same necessity around invention and movement forward. And I want to say that's Rob Dixon. I can send you the book Slow Violence.
Thank you.
But I'm just culling from all of these other brilliant people. But yeah.
This is really exciting. Maybe to wrap it up, Mikolaj, do you have a last question? Shall I ask a last question?
Learning from the past, but also learning from this new perspective that I think very first time in history can have, because I think in this 21st century, we are the very first time accepted that nature is intelligent. This is a breakthrough from a cultural perspective, because we see suddenly, and this is Stefano Mancuso that Es just quoted, but this is also basically all the work that Torkwase quoted, is looking into a much bigger picture of Gaia, of the planet, of Earth, as a part of ourselves. And we understand that plants, for example, if you see them in, you know, the time-lapse photography, for example, that Es mentioned, they act as intelligent beings. They are solving problems, they are cooperating, they live in symbiosis, and they are actually extremely successful, and much more successful than we are until now, if we look from the scale of time of evolution, for example. And the question is, if we really, you know, look from this perspective, how would you all think that our cities can grow? How you think that, you know, we can learn from this perspective of nature, of maybe the universe itself, and how we can apply it to our very concrete next steps?
I can say maybe something, not necessarily so much about cities, but I mean a bit following on, but it then can find itself in, you know, concrete manifestations, for example, in cities. I think when I was growing up, and I grew up in this kind of, you know, the center of industrial production in Germany, that was, you know, I could literally see it from my room, you know, like cars being produced, computers being produced, etc. It really early struck me that our current culture is in a kind of teenage phase, you know? Yes. So it means that it's very excited. It's excited about little gadgets, technology or something, and it's excited by anything it kind of discovers, and it thinks it's like the master of the world, but really it's just a teenager, right? And what separates a teenager from, you know, a grandmother is, you know, like having made experiments, you know, and through having experimented is really the question of balance, you know. I think what our society lacks most is not one modality or the other, or one way of doing things over the other. It's the fine-tuning, it's the balance. And I think if we as a culture understand who we are, what our strengths are, but where our strengths also kind of flip into weaknesses, you know, and we can put these different things into balance, I think then we will also create different cities, it reminds me of this one of Hans Ulrich's little machines, his little word machines, where he says not either or, but both and, you know. But I would say yes, both and, but both and in balance. You know?
Yeah, it works very well in French. Et au lieu de ou au lieu de ni.
It's interesting that you know, you choose the teenager, because I was having this conversation. In fact, I was mentioning the theory of David Abram, the sometimes sleight of hand magician who's become eco-philosopher, who's been really influencing my practice a lot, who looks at, asks himself the question of where, at what point was the real definitive split between humans and the rest of the species on the planet, or the rest of the biosphere as a whole. And he identifies it. I was mentioning this to you the other day in the car, Mikolaj. He mentions his hypothesis that it may have been the moment of invention of the phonetic alphabet, that up to that point, the human knew its place. It knew that when it was singing, it was emulating the sound of a stream or a bird or an animal. When it was drawing, knew that it was leaving a trace in the way that animals leave a trace, in the way that it was echoing the form of the mountain. And in ideographic language, or in hieroglyphic language, there was still that vestigial remain of that interaction, that one was copying what already existed. So you knew that that was the place. And that once one separated off into, you know, phonetic alphabet, then there's a sort of unmooring and a disconnection between the point of reference and the code and the system of referring. And that becomes a sort of feedback loop, or a mirror maze of memory, you know, a feedback loop of our own design and code. And I do think, you know, when I was proposing this, actually doing a talk with Brian Eno just a couple of weeks ago, he disagreed with that. And his theory was yes, interesting, but maybe, and he used sort of the analogy, Tino, that you're using, that perhaps as a culture, as a species, we are still in that solipsistic phase that children go through up until about the age 6. And I think it's around 6, isn't it, that the you know, certain forms of connection happen in the human mind that somewhat have them emerging from solipsism. And his conjecture was that we aren't quite yet emerged from that. And that, as you say, Mikolaj, perhaps we're only just beginning to recognize our place within the biosphere, and that we, you know, in the way that we began to recognize perhaps our place within the cosmos at a certain point, but perhaps still don't quite feel it in our bones. We still use the word horizon to, you know, we still use the word horizontal to indicate something that's a straight line, although we know that the horizon must be curved because the planet's curved. We can't quite rid ourselves of the language that still anchors us to old thinking.
I want to say that concretely, we finally face issues of class, and we finally face issues of the caste system, and we finally face issues of the idea of, I'll just say, indigeneity, quotidian First Peoples practices in relationship to the advancement of some kinds of modern sciences and technologies. That there's some kind of civic structure outside of institutions of higher education, mainly those that are tied to monies of the founding fathers of the Americas, that we create some kind of system where the history of civics, the history of environmental catastrophes address ideas of class, caste, and poverty. I think that and that's sort of a concrete condition that's tied to education. And I think that when we move forward to different cities, how do we create conditions that, and I think that people are doing that well, thinking about pedagogical systems that really newly integrate through this hybrid system of the then and the now. And I just think that we need to put massive infrastructures under things that are already operating in relationship to fairness, you know, and in a real practical way, like put superstructures under local, you know, systems that are already doing reverse catastrophe work.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting that every major religion, the Islam, the Judaism and Christianity is based exactly on this idea, that this is like the very core of every of the major religions, that we need to support ourselves. Charity, for example, is at the very, very heart of every major religion. And somehow through rationality, we developed so far away from this, and all these catastrophes happened, and we are all against our core cultural beliefs. So all the big human catastrophes were against our core cultural beliefs, and that we, you know, lost ourselves somehow.
Yeah, well, that's where, Alice Walker talks about silence, and how one thing that I think core religions also point to that is opposite of what we're doing now, the practice of silence, right? The practice of really deep concentrating and thinking, and the practice of letting the sort of quanta, the idea of the quanta, and the idea of what does it mean to really face the measurable up against the indeterminable in silence.
Yeah, that is a great conclusion. And I think, our next panel should be, again, your last question, Mikolaj, opens up to a necessity for a new panel about the future of the city, because we all, began with this panel in Miami, when in a very participatory way, discussing actually with a room, which was important because it was not, a top-down city, it was a bottom-up city, a city which listens. Goes actually back to a conversation with Tino. Many years ago, when at the Serpentine we did the Manifesto Marathon, Tino said that maybe the 21st century, should less be about proclaiming manifestos, but then also about listening. And I think that's important in relation for the city. We were really listening to the room. I remember in this display by Francis Queré, and it was a way of being together. And I hope we can be again together, all with, with many participants on such a future panel where we can discuss the future of the city. And of course, the amazing thing was that, it was recorded, but also Virgil Abloh was actually recording it on his iPhone. And what we didn't know is that at the very, very last moment, when we just ended the panel, he immediately, instantaneously transmitted the sound file to his classroom, basically at the AA, and wanted his students and participants to continue to think and bring in their ideas, and was already a few hours after the panel building a model. So I hope we can, continue to experiment with this bottom-up idea of a city. And thank you so much to our amazing participants. Mikolaj and I are so grateful to Torkwase, to Es, to Tino, and we hope to see you all soon.
Nice to meet you both.
Nice to meet you both.
Really lovely to connect with everyone. Thank you.
Lots of love. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.